Are we ready to get started? Anything else, Sam, we need before I dive in?
No, no, no. Go for it. It's all yours.
Excellent. So I'm going to share my screen here. Here we go. You should see my screen coming up here momentarily. And yeah, a few visuals to work with here. So I'm Brian. I'm going to try to give you a kind of whirlwind tour. We only have, 45 minutes, a little less now, 40 minutes left. So this is going to be a high-level whirlwind introduction, but at least give you a taste of what's this Holacracy thing really all about. And within the broader context that it sits, self-management, there's a number, quite a few methods out there now that have something to do with self-management, although very few that are in the same category of what Holacracy is trying to do. So we'll talk about that. I'm the founder, creator of this Holacracy thing. For me, this journey started quite a while ago, about 15 years. I was in a software company that I had founded, and I was building my software company and looking for a new way to run my own organization. So Holacracy, it didn't come about from a theoretical point of view. My background wasn't management consulting or academic or anything like that. This was just my way of running my own company. For years, we experimented. We went out there, and myself and my co-founders, we tried every technique, idea, process, anything we could think of, all with this kind of burning question, this sense, there's just got to be a better way to do this. I had suffered from so much of the bureaucracy, the politics, the egos, the resistance to change. It felt in the past to me like it was almost like our companies were perfectly designed to resist change, right? And the sense was there's just got to be a better way. So Holacracy was the result of years of experimentation in my own company. And then I never really intended to spread it, but others started getting interested. And so I started pursuing that interest and following it and supporting some others just kind of on the side from my main job of CEO of my software company. And then eventually I left it and started Holacracy One, the company I'm with now, to help spread this to the world. And there are now well over 1,000 companies all over the world doing Holacracy, and it's growing quite quickly. So let me see if I can give you a tour. And I want to start with a story that just gives a kind of a sense of what this is, where this was coming from, and what one of my fundamental goals was. And this is a true story and quite an inspirational one for me, although not inspirational in the good sense. It was a day I nearly died. So I'm a private pilot, and I was flying an airplane. But at this point, I was still a student pilot. This was, almost 20 years ago. And, I had maybe 20 hours of flight time at this point, and it was time for my first cross-country solo flight. It's my first flight where I'm going, hundreds of miles away from my home airport with no instructor for the first time. And I barely knew how to fly the plane at this point, right? But sure enough, they let you get up in an airplane alone after 20 hours of practice and fly far away. So I'm flying along, and along the journey, the low voltage light comes on my instrument panel. And they don't teach you much about the airplane hardware at this point in time. So I didn't really know how the systems worked. I didn't know what that meant. But my instinct was check the other instruments, right? So one by one, I start looking at all the other instruments on my control panel. And one by one, every other instrument reads everything's fine, right? My altimeter is fine. I'm not losing altitude. My airspeed's fine. I'm not losing speed. Plenty of fuel. My navigation's on course. Everything is fine, except for the low voltage light. So I just let the other instruments outvote the low voltage light, right? I figured this must not be that big of a deal, right? No other instruments reading anything anomalous, so I'm just gonna ignore the low voltage light and keep flying, right? How big of a problem could it be? It's only one instrument reporting anything off. Turns out that was a really bad decision. Really bad decision. I nearly crashed the airplane that day. And I ended up completely lost in a storm with no navigation, no radios, no lights, nearly out of fuel, and violating international airspace. I did make it down, barely. And I kind of reflected on this, and I realized this is what's happening in companies. This is what I've been living with, even in my own company at the time. I was a new CEO. I started my company recently. We were building and growing it. I realized, one way you can think about this, it's us people who become the instruments. We sense reality on behalf of the organization. And it's often one lone person who sees something important that no one else does. And it's really hard to drive change in a company when you're the lone sensor of something that could be better. I'm sure if you reflect, I'm sure you've had experiences where you've been the low voltage light in your career, right? Have you ever been the one that sensed something that either only a minority sensed or most people didn't around you and found it really difficult to get that change driven in that organization? It happens all the time. So I looked at what gets in the way of one lone person driving change. What I realized is I wanted to build an organization that didn't make the same mistake I did as a pilot. I wanted to build an organization where anything sensed by anyone, anywhere in the organization, could drive meaningful change if it's relevant to the purpose, even if no one else sees it, even if no one else gets it. Right? How can we build organizations where anything sensed by anyone, anywhere in the company can drive meaningful change? So for me, I started looking at, well, what gets in the way, right? And that was the question that I experimented around. What gets in the way of driving change? Lots of stuff does, right? When your boss doesn't see it, or when they're just too busy, they might agree with you, or you have to call a big painful meeting, right? How many times I've seen meetings where everybody generally agrees and still nothing gets done, right? I mean, everyone agrees on the problem, but that doesn't mean we all can converge on a solution, and the expectation that we will gets in the way, right? There's so many things that get in the way. One of them that I eventually came to was the management hierarchy itself. This is the way we've been structuring organizations for quite some time. Interestingly, I never set out to remove management hierarchy, which is exactly what my work does. It's a replacement. Holacracy is a replacement for the management hierarchy. But that was never the goal. The goal was to build an organization where anyone can drive change with what they sense. And that requires some things. And I actually found it requires the same things that we want a management hierarchy to do. It just needs to happen better than a management hierarchy can do it, right? I'm actually a fan of management hierarchy, despite my work being about throwing it out. We get many needed things out of this. We need a way to clarify who does what. We need a way to break down work. We need a way to, when something is stuck, make sure it gets unstuck. We need accountability. We need alignment. We need everything the management hierarchy provides. But that doesn't imply that we need to use this specific strategy to get there. One way of looking at holacracy is management without managers. Right? We do need the functions of management hierarchy. So one of the big misconceptions that happens out there in the world when I talk about holacracy being, no managers, people assume what I mean is no structure. And that's not at all what I mean. Companies today running with holacracy are more structured, not less than a management hierarchy. They just get to the structure differently. And I'd say one of the things holacracy provides is more of what we ideally want, but rarely get in management hierarchy, right? Like as a CEO, what I wanted from all of the managers in my organization and from myself was not micromanagement. I didn't want managers who just got stuck in firefighting mode and directed the action all the time. I wanted managers that created clarity on their team, that said, here are the boundaries, here are the responsibilities. Within that, I'm not going to micromanage, I'm going to empower you. But the reality was, it's really hard to do that in this kind of system. And when you get a manager who's really good at that, they get promoted and replaced by a manager who's not really good at that. Right? There's just not enough to go around, and there's not enough support and help. Even myself, I thought I was a pretty empowering boss, and I ran into issues myself. Right? I had bad days. I had days where I got stressed and frustrated and slipped into micromanagement and realized it later. I wanted guide rails for myself that kept me out of that mode too. Not because I had some value on being egalitarian, although I do value the utility of that. It's more, I want an organization that can express its purpose. I was building a purpose-driven organization. And the realization was simply when you give people real autonomy, real power, real ability to use their judgment, their wisdom, to express a purpose, you simply get a more purposeful, more conscious, more mindful organization that can achieve better results for that purpose. Right? So we need the things management provides, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to get there through a top-down hierarchy of managers. It was one of my big realizations. Another thing people often get a misconception is if you throw out managers, all decisions must be made via consensus with groups. And that also couldn't be further from the truth. It's ironic to me that that's a common fear I hear, because as far as I can tell, consensus is what's used in most management hierarchies, right? I mean, rarely in most companies today do things get run up the management hierarchy to decide. More often than not, we call a big meeting and we socialize it and we try to get everyone bought in. And that's where so many decisions get blessed, and that becomes what makes it okay to act, right? Companies running with Holacracy have less consensus seeking, not more. Right? The focus instead is clarifying who makes which decision so that the person in charge of that decision can go lead. The other ultimate irony I want to point out about management hierarchy is even when you try to do this really well, which I was trying to do, there's something I think fundamentally ironic about if you need an empowering boss to empower you, you're in a fundamentally disempowering system, right? If you need a heroic leader, you know, a boss who is brilliant and wise and conscious and empowers his people, you're in a fundamentally disempowering environment. You are fundamentally not empowered if you are dependent on somebody else to empower you. I'm fortunate I don't live in a feudal empire in my normal societal life. I don't need an empowering baron or king to empower me. I'm in a system that provides some fundamental power. Right? I'm in a system that provides a way of achieving order without relying on empowering top-down bosses to direct the action and create empowerment. In fact, I can pretty much fly into any modern city I want today and trust that I can find a ride to a place to eat, get a good healthy meal full of ingredients from all over the world. I can find a place to sleep, and I can do all of that without a supply chain management department trying to top-down direct the entire action. Right? I can do that without a hierarchy of managers, without kings and barons telling us peasants where to go and what to do and how to live our lives. Right? There's a different framework here. There is a framework. There's a framework in our societies. There's rules, there's laws, there's regulations, right? We have a framework, but that framework is not trying to direct the specific decision-making within it. Right? It's providing boundaries within which there's a lot of freedom, right? We have the freedom to self-organize, to adapt. This is how we get emergent order. We've long since learned as a human species, this works better when complexity goes up than a top-down attempt to plan the economy, which, by the way, actually works okay when complexity is very low. Right? Go back to tribal villages and more top-down approaches when we saw them, which actually wasn't even that common, worked better. Even in the feudal ages, top-down approaches to direct and plan an economy worked better than they do in a modern society because the complexity level was radically different. When complexity goes up, self-organization gets more valuable, more necessary. And that's really what Holacracy is all about. It's an alternate framework. Just like that societal example, there is a framework. Holacracy brings in a framework. It's not telling you what to do. It's giving you a framework of boundaries, of processes to self-organize. Within that framework, you can kind of change anything. You can customize anything. You can self-organize. So it's a replacement for the framework we use today, which is the management hierarchy, more often than not. And it is a replacement. At the end of the day, companies running with Holacracy have nothing that looks like a management hierarchy. Now, it can take years to get there. This is a massive change, and it's a cultural change. You don't just say, we're doing Holacracy, and you're done, right? Nothing changes day one. It's a journey. But at the end of the day, companies really doing this have embedded a rule system that replaces the power resting in a CEO and then down a hierarchy of managers. Now, the power rests in a set of rules. And those rules define a governance process. And the governance process empowers roles. So it's a different way of breaking down. Instead of CEO to managers on down a hierarchy, it's a constitution, which I'll talk more about soon, empowering a governance process, which empowers whatever roles and process the team creates in it. And there are no more managers. There's nothing that looks like a manager. There's nothing that looks like a CEO. That title becomes obsolete. You may still use it if you want somebody to have a fancy title when they're talking to the press or customers or whatever. But inside the company, it means nothing. Right? It's an alternate framework for achieving order. And it brings in the very things that we often try to get with a management hierarchy and then see as getting in the way of empowerment. See, irony here. One of the things I found is if you want real empowerment, you can't just throw out the things that get in the way of it. The boundaries, the structures, the policies, all the stuff we see in companies today that seems bureaucratic. You know, if you go to your team tomorrow, if you're a team lead or a manager, if you go to your team and say, you know, we're just throwing out all the rules, you're empowered, good luck. You don't get an empowering team. You get a bunch of confused people, right? When people sense there really are some boundaries, but they're not clear, then they don't spend their time leading within the boundaries. They spend their time being cautious about hitting the boundaries. You know, if you don't know your limits, you don't know your freedom. If you don't know what you can't do without talking to anyone, then you don't really have empowerment. So one of the things Holacracy does is focus on how do we really clarify these things, but get the right ones, not the bureaucratic ones that are in the way, but the minimally sufficient, lightweight, clear boundaries so that we can take a genuine stance and tell people within these boundaries, lead. Right? Use your judgment, use your leadership, and lead. So the goal of Holacracy is to clarify these. This is what I mean when I say it's actually more structure, not less. But we get there differently. It's a lightweight, nimble, agile structure. Right? That's the other lesson that I've learned from this. If you want good structure, it's not enough to just clarify all this stuff up front. If you try to clarify all the boundaries up front, you're going to end up with a disaster of complexity. You're going to end up with way too much structure, or at least the wrong structure. So we need a way to learn and adapt and evolve the boundaries over time. So let me give some examples of how this works. Holacracy is a role-based system. So this is a role I'm filling right now, our Holacracy spokesperson role. Right? I get to go do a lot of talks on Holacracy, that kind of thing. My role has a purpose. Every role in Holacracy has a purpose. And it's a breakdown of my team's purpose, which is a part of my overall company's purpose or my larger team's purpose or whatever. And then my role has some accountabilities. This tells others what can they expect of me. And here's the golden rule of Holacracy. When I fill a role, I have the full authority to make any decision or take any action anywhere in the company to get the job done, even if it's outside what I normally do, as long as there's no rule against it. This is the opposite of the way most companies work. In most companies today, there's an implicit culture that says, don't do things you don't normally do without permission. And you get permission either by running it up a management hierarchy, or more likely by calling a meeting, socializing it, and getting everyone bought in. And if you don't believe me, you can do a test in your company. You can go make a big, bold, autocratic decision without talking to anyone first, outside of your normal area. And you can inform people that you made this decision after the fact, and you can see how many people are pissed off. If anyone is upset with you, that's a surefire sign that you're in a culture that requires permission first. Holacracy is actually the opposite. It says you already have permission. If you're leading your role, if you're trying to get your purpose met, you have the full authority. You can make any decision in the company or any action unless there's a rule against it, meaning an actual documented rule that came out of our team's governance process. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So this is different. This is very different in practice. The burden is on your colleagues if they want to slow you down, not you to get their buy-in first. Right? If they want some boundaries, great. We do need some boundaries. We don't want everyone doing anything all the time. We want some boundaries. The burden is on the people that need to protect their piece of the system to get the minimally sufficient boundaries they need to do that. Right? So the burden isn't on you to get permission before acting. The burden is on everyone else to clarify the boundaries they need to keep their areas safe. And even that, they don't need to do up front. They can do it in most cases. It's safe enough to see what happens and learn where the boundaries need to be over time. There might be some boundaries you want up front. Fine, put those in up front. But mostly this can be a learning, evolving process over time. So here's an example of how we define boundaries. Here's another role I work with, our web architect. This role has a domain, the website. So this role controls our website. A domain in Holacracy is like the property of this role. What that's telling me in my spokesperson role is I can do anything that makes sense to me, but if I want to mess with the website, I need to check in with the person filling this role. It's Olivier in this case, my colleague. I need to check with Olivier and make sure I'm not going to cause any harm on the website with whatever my intended action is. Because his role controls the website. Doesn't matter if he's the newest hire. There's no status at play here. There's no management levels. All that matters is his role controls the website and, for its purpose. Clear and stylish website. Great. I have to make sure I'm not going to cause harm to his purpose before I mess with the website. And when we first started our company, we didn't have a domain on website anywhere, which meant everyone could just use their judgment. They could just go update the website anytime because we can all take whatever action makes sense to us to do our role, unless there's a boundary. And before we created that domain, there was no boundary. And that worked fine when we were 3 people as a startup. And it even worked as we started growing and we got to 6, 7 people. But at some point, it stopped working. At some point, the web architect said, look, I can't keep this website functioning effectively if anyone just updates it anytime. So they created a domain, and we learned we needed to kind of centralize control of the website in a decentralized system, which is one of the things I love about Holacracy. It's not choosing centralization or decentralization. It's harnessing the best of both where you can use them. It's a decentralized framework and system to begin with. Everyone can take any action. But within that, we can selectively centralize control of different aspects of the business. And not up a management hierarchy, but out to the different roles that need to steward those areas. And we can change all that, right? If you want real empowerment, you cannot start by trying to define this in advance. You'll overdo it and underdo it at the same time. You'll end up with too much structure in some parts and not enough in others. So what you can do is start with the lightest weight structure you can imagine, and then learn together, where do you need boundaries? Where do you need rules? Where do you need expectations on each other too? And Holacracy does that in a governance meeting. So far from being a one-size-fits-all, Holacracy doesn't tell you anything about how to run your company. It just gives you the meta framework to do that. It tells you, here's how you do the governance process within which you can change anything else on your team. So this is one of our teams, our outreach team, like marketing. And my spokesperson role is in here, and so is our web architect and some other roles. And once every month or thereabouts, the whole team comes together. Anyone filling a role on the team is invited into the governance process of this team. And in that governance process, they can propose changing any other role of the team. Right? They can add domains if they want to centralize control. They can remove domains if something has gotten too controlled. They can add roles if they need to expect some new stuff, a new function. They can merge roles, split roles. They can add expectations onto roles. They can add policies of the team. And every team is doing this. Every team is regularly doing this governance process. This is what I mean by a framework. Holacracy gives you a framework for how to do governance, but within that governance process, you define every process, everything about your team. Holacracy does not tell you how to run your company. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. You have all sorts of important processes to define, roles to figure out. It just gives you the meta framework to do that and to keep it dynamic instead of the meta framework of management hierarchy, which is also, by the way, a meta framework. Management hierarchy doesn't tell you how to run your business either. It just gives you a basic way to break down and figure that out. Holacracy is a replacement for that. You still have to do the hard work of figuring out how to run your business. So let me give you an example of how this actually works in practice. This is a true story. Quite some years ago, we had a tension. A role I worked with, we call it our casting agent role. Casting agent books my spokesperson role here for talks. So we get a lot of invitations like this one. We have to sort through them. A lot of them are for live conferences that I go and speak at, and we can't possibly say yes to all of them. So our casting agent has to negotiate with the conference organizer, figure out if it's the right fit for us, negotiate a price and all that stuff, and then figure out which ones we're going to say yes to and no to. But at the end of the day, she has to get me to go actually give the talk, right? So at the end of the day, what was happening was she would negotiate with the conference organizer. She would spend a lot of energy building a relationship. And at the end of her process, she'd present me the opportunity, and I'd say, no, I'm not going to do that. I think it's the wrong audience, or the wrong market, or it's not big enough, or whatever. And she felt some tension. I mean, you can imagine, right? She feels totally disempowered here. She's built a relationship, she's negotiated, and I shoot it down and refuse to go at the end of the day. So here's what actually happened. She showed up in the governance meeting of our team, right? My role and hers are on the same team. We work together regularly. She shows up in that governance meeting, and she proposed what is now the third accountability here on my role. It says defining criteria for acceptable speaking engagements. Right? This is where this one actually came from. So when we first created this role, we didn't have a list of accountabilities. We had one accountability on this role. We started with the lightest weight, minimally sufficient structure we could possibly imagine, which was just a purpose to meet and one expectation, one accountability. Right? And she came and said, hey, here's my tension, right? I'm negotiating, wasting time, building relationships. But if I could expect the spokesperson to define the criteria for what you'll accept or not, then I could assess the opportunity myself at the beginning of my process against that criteria. So I would like to expect that of the spokesperson. And expectations in Holacracy are defined by these accountabilities, so she wanted to add an accountability. It took about 2 minutes in that meeting. That meeting process, I'm not going to go into it in depth now. You can find more on our website if you're curious. It's not a consensus-based process. We're not asking, does everyone agree with that proposal? We're asking a different question. We're only asking, does anyone see any reasons why adding that expectation onto spokesperson role will get in your way of doing your work? That's it. The change is accepted by default unless somebody can say, here's why it will get in the way of me doing my work. And if they can say that, that doesn't stop the change. It just gives us a puzzle to solve. How do we meet her need without actually getting in the way of your work? So that's a process, and we went through that. It took 2 minutes. At the end of 2 minutes, we had that new expectation added to my role, and she could turn to me and say, so when do you think you'll have that done for me by? Now, the interesting footnote to this story, I'm the founder of the company and a seasoned CEO for many years before this. She was our newest hire right out of college. In what companies do you know where the newest hire right out of college in 2 minutes can add an expectation onto the founder and then turn to him and say, so when are you going to have that done for me by? Give me an estimate. Right? Expecting that, of course, she had a right to expect that from me. That's what Holacracy enables. It removes the status, the egos, the power, the politics, all that crap. It's not about that. It's about she has a role and I have a role. Her role needs something from my role. That's what this is fundamentally about now. And we learn together. What do we need to expect together? What are the boundaries we need to honor together? When we do that really well, we simply don't need managers doing that kind of poorly. Right? That's the beauty to me of Holacracy. It's doing what we want a good manager to do anyway, to create clarity and power and get out of our way. Right? That's what this is doing. It's just management without managers. But now it's inviting everyone to take part in it. The other issue, that's really hard. I don't know many managers who can figure out upfront how to do that for a whole team or even learn over time. It's hard. Here, we're inviting everyone to get involved in that work. Anyone can bring a proposal to change the structure of expectations or boundaries on the team. Right? And we're doing it one tension at a time. We're doing it by actually sensing into what's in the way right now of the work, or where are the opportunities? Both of those fit that definition of tension. Right? Where are the opportunities to improve something? Where are the gaps where we could be better expressing our purpose? And we're learning from them. So we are iterating on the design. Right? We are rapidly iterating, learning, and adapting. Right? Tensions are driving change. And when that scales, you're doing it in every team. Every team has its governance process. Every team has its roles, its policies. Right? And then you have larger circles that include sub-circles. And that larger circle is defining the boundaries between the circles. Right? What does our marketing team control versus the sales team? What do they expect of each other? The governance process is never telling anyone specifically what to do. It's only defining the boundaries. It's defining the expectations. It's defining the limits. That's what we're doing there. The scales, this is a picture of Zappos' structure, 1,000, 1,500 or so employees, hundreds of circles, thousands of roles, right? And it's organic, it's living, it's breathing, it's shifting, it's changing. And it starts with a constitution, right? So this is the fundamental shift of Holacracy. We are taking power out of the hands of a CEO, breaking it down a management hierarchy, and putting it into a process that defines a governance structure, which then will define your roles and empower them. So power shifts from vesting in a CEO to vesting in a constitutional governance process. That's the major shift here. The first move companies make when they want to adopt this, once they've gotten at least a little bit of a taste of it and they're ready to actually say, yes, let's do Holacracy, they sign the Constitution. The CEO does. The CEO says, I'm ceding my power to run this company however I want, and I'm putting it into this constitutional process. That's the shift. From there, the governance process breaks down and defines every other process in the organization. How do we hire? How do we pay? How do we budget? How do we market? How do we sell? How do we build our products? What do we expect from the different roles? None of that is defined by Holacracy. Holacracy defines the meta framework for how you define all the other stuff. So to summarize, we're going from static job descriptions that, let's be honest, nobody cares about and nobody ever looks at because they don't have any real clarity in them, to dynamic roles that are the outputs of the team's learning process. They're real, they have meaningful clarity in them, right? And they're dynamic, they're changing constantly as we learn together. Instead of authority being delegated down a hierarchy, it starts in a constitution, which gives it to a governance process, which gives it to the roles that we create through it. There is no boss to veto, to counteract. There's no team you need consensus of to act. Your role leads. Everyone is like the CEO of their role. You have complete authority to make any decision in the company as long as there's no rule against it. And we will learn over the time where those boundaries need to be. Which means instead of doing the giant reorg where we try to get the design right every few years, we're doing micro reorgs in every team every few weeks in a governance meeting. And it's tension driven. We're iterating on the design of our company, one tension at a time, and we're letting it organically evolve and emerge. Which means we no longer need to get alignment by playing politics. Right? We now have a different way. This doesn't magically stop people from trying to be political. What it does is give them a better tool. Right? Imagine my casting agent person. In a typical management hierarchy, it would have taken her, I imagine, more than 2 minutes to get a new expectation on the founder of the company and then demand an estimate from him of when it's going to get done. Right? It's going to take more than 2 minutes. And probably the most effective path she's got is being really sensitive, playing some politics. Governance is simply a more effective process. Instead of the politics, you've got a different way to get alignment. You can just propose what you need, and it's about the purposes and the roles. Okay, so I want to leave some time for questions with the rest of our time. So let me pause there and shift into some Q&A. So what haven't I covered? I know this is a big picture, high-level whirlwind tour. What would you like me to speak a little bit more about or answer or clarify further in here? And please do feel free to be skeptical as well. And this is very new, very different, and we're still learning. There's thousands of companies doing it, but it's still pretty new in terms of a complete framework for self-management. There's a lot of companies experimenting with self-management, but Holacracy is really the first that's a complete framework to enable it. So what can I tell you?
Come on, guys. This is your chance. You've got Brian here all to yourselves. Are you guys okay if we go another 15 minutes? Is that okay with everyone? Because otherwise we only have 5. Brian, is that okay with you?
I have another meeting at the top of the hour, but I could definitely go another, say, 10 to 15, as long as I'm done 5 minutes before.
Okay, perfect. We'll do like a hard stop then at that time. So guys, quickly ask your questions. Don't be shy.
So Brian, this is Andreas. Thank you for this talk. Can I ask you what you think about the chances of starting with Holacracy in a smaller part of the organization?
Yes, totally. So it works and it's harder. I've seen this in a few cases very successfully, and in a lot of cases not successfully at all. So the challenge is you have a thinner boundary between the rest of the organization to navigate versus if a whole company's doing it, You still have a world around you doing a different paradigm. You have customers, you have all that stuff, but that's a thicker boundary, and it's usually easier to kind of do things differently in a bubble. But if you're in a department, you kind of need a bubble, right? You obviously have customers around you, internal ones, stakeholders, you have other departments. Where it works best is when that department is a little bit of a bubble, at least. You might have still connections, of course, across it, but you have more internal functions together than you do have crossing across the boundary. And you have a manager who really has the political capital to say, I'm doing things a little differently on my team. From there, you can still present to the rest of the world much like they would expect. You know, your customers don't need to know you're doing Holacracy. They just need their needs met, right? And that works inside a company as well. Your internal organizational stakeholders, they don't need to know that you're doing things totally differently, but they do need their needs met, and you've got to manage that boundary. Where it gets harder is when your team is stuck with some of the bigger organizational framework. Like there was a team in Google that did Holacracy, and it was actually working great for a while until the broader company did a big reorg. And it had nothing to do with Holacracy, but they just split the department in two and put 2 new managers in place. And the 2 new managers were like, what's this? Nah, get rid of it. And it was done, just like that. So it can be vulnerable. The other challenge they had is the broader company dictated, here's how you have to do firing and compensation. And they didn't have the authority to find a new method. And what happened was the broader methods presumed management hierarchy and made it harder. That said, they found a way to do it reasonably well within that constraint. So it was working for them before the reorg. And there are plenty of examples. There's teams in Dannon, Starwood, there's government agencies, even in bigger governments doing this. So it does work that way. It's just a bigger challenge. Get coaching if you can, get a good coach, get good training, get something if you're going to tackle that kind of challenge. But it is possible.
Thank you.
What else we got?
Yeah, hi, I have a question for you. My name is Roberto again.
Cool.
So what about KPIs, like indicators? Should every small group organization have its own KPIs, or are there global KPIs, or how is it managed, right?
Yeah, Holacracy tells you nothing about how to do that, so it's up for each company to figure that out. This is the beauty to me of Holacracy. It's not the answers it gives you, it's all the answers it doesn't give you, because that invites you to figure it out. So let me turn the question around. Have you ever had any tension in a company about how you do KPIs? Have you ever felt anything that could be better about that process, or anything that gets in the way? Right? Especially when you start getting compensation tied to KPIs, I often find those systems get in the way more often than they help. Right? Have you ever had any tension about your compensation system, the way you pay people? Right? And if so, have you had a clear pathway to change the way your company does KPIs or compensation or budgeting or whatever process we're talking about? Holacracy's goal is not to give you the one right way to do KPIs or budgeting or compensation. It's to make sure that you can adapt those processes, that you can sense into the actual tensions that are there and propose changes through a defined process that biases towards accepting changes instead of resisting them. That's what Holacracy is. It's a meta framework. It doesn't tell you how to do KPIs. What most teams find doing Holacracy is that having upfront targets becomes a lot less important in most companies. Some find it's actually really important and they do something with it, but most companies find having upfront defined KPIs, especially ones that they measure performance against, as not that useful. Or worse, actually harmful to a self-organizing enterprise and to their purpose. But that's not prescribed by Holacracy. That's just the common finding. Some teams still do something. I see some teams experimenting with OKRs and using them really not in any way to measure individual performance, but just to kind of orient a team around, get them aligned. And then they have governance that spells out, here's how we do OKRs. Here are the roles involved in doing OKRs. Here's the policies about what OKRs mean here. And here's some policies about how we have to prioritize our work for the OKRs, right? You can have all of that in Holacracy, or any other system that you can dream up. It's just giving you the meta framework to do it. And be cautious. If you're trying to do self-management of any sort, not just Holacracy, watch out for any kind of upfront defined targets that you're trying to measure performance by. My experience is they almost always get in the way of the purpose and of any kind of effective agility and self-management. Cool.
Yeah, I guess you're right. And you know what? Actually, what really happens is that when organizations try to make these kind of changes, their reflect is like, okay, how are we going to measure? How are we not going to know if it's working? Are we going to know if it's better? So that's why I was asking this kind of question, because it's the old mindset, you know, that they always want to measure things. They want to make sure that they're targeting and stuff like that.
So let me speak to that. There are some interesting things that you can measure to see what impact Holacracy is having. And some of my favorite were done by actually a government. There was a department within the Washington state government in the US that was doing Holacracy. And they measured before and after Holacracy, how many meeting minutes did it take you to get a clear action or clear decision from someone else when you needed it, right? And they measured this and got some averages before and after 6 months of Holacracy practice. And the metric, the number of meeting minutes needed for clear action or clear decision from someone else decreased by 90% after 6 months of Holacracy. In other words, they could do 10 times the amount of clear decision-making in the organization after this versus before. So that was one thing. They also tried to measure how many meeting minutes did it take you before and after Holacracy when you needed not just a clear action or decision, but you needed a change to an organizational policy or somebody else's job. And they tried to measure the improvement in that, but they couldn't, because the answers from all the surveys from before Holacracy came back infinite. In other words, it doesn't matter how long we spend in meetings trying to get changes to policies or other people's jobs. It's just not possible. We can't do it. We've spent hours and hours and hours over years and not gotten there. And after Holacracy, it was an average of 20 minutes to get a clear change to a fundamental organizational policy or someone else's job, right? So it's kind of an interesting metric there in that it's not just an efficiency improvement, it's a new capacity that wasn't there before.
That's right.
So there's interesting things like that you can measure. Okay, cool. What other questions we got?
Brian, if I can jump in. My name is Romeo.
Mm-hmm.
Let me enable my video because otherwise it feels really impolite. Okay, so hi. I'm part of an organization that has just jumped into Holacracy.
Cool.
And I'm a former manager who has been trying to implement some of the concepts of Management 3.0. So some of Jürgen Appello's ideas in the formerly established organization. I was not very successful at bringing that to the organization. I was trying to bring some forms of self-organization to my team, empower them more, but all within the context of a traditionally run organization. So yeah, that was somewhat cumbersome. I was really happy with reading ideas from the Management 3.0 world, try to implement some of those. And then at a certain point towards the end of last year, it was proclaimed that this company would become a Holacracized company, if that is a word. Which is, of course, as you know, the decision to move to Holacracy is not holacratic in itself. It's a top-down decision. Interesting concept, I think. But I started reading up on Holacracy. I liked the idea, and so far we're now actually in the game for about 5 weeks, and I still like it. Maybe the honeymoon period is not quite over yet, but I'm still with it, and I still like it a lot. But I think that I've been looking at this, having been formally thinking about how to apply Holacracy or Management 3.0 ideas in my work and in work with my team. Now being rolling along on the way of Holacracy, and I actually have a feeling that these two aspects these two ideas are in ways quite complementary. Because of, for example, the fact that one of the major, often recurring criticisms of Holacracy is that it's it has too less emphasis and too less feel for the people in the organization, and it's all about roles, it's all about process. So yeah, I don't know how much you have worked yourself with Management 3.0 ideas, But I was curious to hear from you whether you agree with that assessment that they may be complementary, or that you actually feel that they're actually very distant and or orthogonal maybe.
Yeah, no, I do agree with it. So what I find is often the case with a lot of other, there's a lot of work out there that is looking at how do you bring in principles within the existing structures we have. Management 3.0 does. My background's with agile software development, right? Which is, it's all about new principles for how we build software, new processes for how we build software, but it's within a container that is still top-down management hierarchy power structure. Right. Same thing with Management 3.0. It's looking at what are the principles and micro practices, right, you can bring in within this broader container. And in that way, I think it's both powerful and fundamentally limited because there's only so much you can do within that old container. Right. What I often find is like they clash. I found this in the Agile days. I love Agile. I ran an Agile software business. And the challenge is when I would help our clients adopt Agile, we'd run into these issues with, they're in this broader container that is fighting with it, like it just doesn't fit. The way budgeting's done, the way management's done, performance is done is all in this different paradigm. And then it's like the corporate antibodies come out and resist this weird new set of practices and principles. And the beautiful thing to me about Holacracy, it's changing the container. It's not trying to change every way you do things within the container. It's giving you a context that's aligned with these new principles. And that actually empowers those new micro practices and principles far more. So, there are not, lots of companies today doing agile software development in the Holacracy container now, and they're completely compatible. They're working at different levels. Holacracy is giving you the meta framework. Agile is giving you the specific framework for how you build software, right? And the principles are totally aligned. If anything, Holacracy is liberating them to actually achieve what I think is their full potential in the first place. And I think that's true with Management 3.0 as well. The one thing you have to filter out of that is where do they presume that you have to have management authority centralized up a hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. And there usually are in all of those methods I find out there that are new paradigm methods. There's usually some places where they're presuming that that's really the only way to break down authority. So the challenge is finding the ways where that assumption is built in, just reframing it and saying, well, if I let go of that assumption, what's the wisdom in this? And my experience is there's usually lots of wisdom in those methods and those ideas. And highly compatible ones, because Holacracy intentionally is not trying to address all of the needs of a business. It's only trying to replace the meta framework of management hierarchy. And by the way, on the people thing, I think that's actually based on misunderstanding. Those articles are almost always written by people who have never actually spent a lot of time in a Holacracy-powered company. If you're interested in a little bit more about that, I wrote a blog post called The Humanity of Holacracy, which is, we actually invited, that came about because a reporter had written one of those stories about how Holacracy is, rigid, robotic, inhuman, which is a normal first reaction to it. It's deeply flawed. So we actually invited her. We said, come to a 5-day Holacracy training and get deep immersed in it. And, no expectations, but we saw your negative article and we want to invite you in. And we gave her a free seat. She came into our training. And then I wrote that Holacracy is Human blog post as kind of my response to some of what I read in hers about what I thought she was missing. And I shared it with her and I said, just consider it, go through the training. She did. She came out the other side and actually apologized and said, I was so wrong. My stance is this is the most human, conscious, connected, caring, loving way I've ever seen to run a company. I want more love in my companies, and Holacracy is my tool for doing that. And she came out the other side of the training saying, I was so wrong, I'm sorry. And then she wrote a new article with an opposite perspective. And the new article didn't get spread at all because it didn't have the sensational headline.
Yeah, as it usually works. So actually, I wasn't suggesting that it's my opinion that the people side is lacking, but the description of the constitution, the processes, it is all about processes. And as you put it yourself in your book, of course, having that framework and having the rigid structure there basically liberates you or enables you to be focusing on the roles in the meetings while you can still interact as people very warmly and openly outside of those meetings and switch those two perspectives, which to me makes a lot of sense. But I've seen that it doesn't to everyone, but it does not to all.
And I think you're right. You need new processes on top of Holacracy. It's just the framework. It's like having an operating system for your computer. You know, it's great to have a good I love my Mac and I love Mac OS. And what makes my computer really powerful is all the apps I put on top of it. And Holacracy is like an operating system. You still need apps. And that's where a lot of those other methods, they give you apps. They say, here's a great way to do performance stuff, or here's a great way to do compensation or hiring or whatever. And all of those are like the apps on this platform, and you need them. So yeah, hugely valuable.
Cool. Thank you for the elaborate explanation.
Thank you. What other questions do we have? We have, time. Okay, let's sneak in one more. One more question, and then we'll call it. No? Okay, good. Well, thank you for helping me honor my time commitment then. In that case, let me leave you with one final thought, which is if you want to dive in and learn more, there is so much out there on the web. If you go to our website, holacracy.org, you'll find videos about that governance meeting and what that's like. You'll find a huge blog full of articles written by people, not just us, but in companies living this every day. There's a community site with lots of resources. If you want a deeper dive, there's trainings on that website all over the world. There's coaches. We have licensed coaches all over the world. They're all listed on the website. So check that out. We have an online workshop that's a hands-on simulation-based workshop. If you want to get kind of an easy taste from your own office, check out our online workshop on our website as well. And explore, dive in. Good luck exploring new ways of organizing. Thanks for having me, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much, Brian. Before everyone goes, just so you know, every month, wait, Nadine, you're not recording anymore, are you? Yes, you are. Every month we have these fabulous seminars. So sign up, go through our website, and we have, Management 3.0 seminars monthly with excellent guests. So Brian, thank you. This was super, super interesting. And really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
So thanks, everyone. Have a good day.